Okay, this is the lecture I would have given in class on historical fiction. So you should definitely work on putting these in some kind of notes. Most works of historical fiction are realistic. And by realistic, I mean realistic works should depict everyday life. However, that doesn't mean that every reader will identify with every story, but the events in the story should be events that could realistically happen in real life. One of the aspects of realism, and we'll talk more about this next week as well, is that adults do not necessarily make the world better or safer for children. Children have to learn how the world works and adapt to it. The historical part of historical fiction is that it takes place significantly earlier than its period of composition. One scholar defines the historical novel as one where history actually impinges on characters and scenes rather than simply serves as a backdrop. And usually the kind of rule of thumb is 50 years earlier than the date the novel was written for like what counts as history. The historical novel in general arose in the 19th century with Sir Walter Scott, who wrote Ivanhoe, and which is a novel that kind of incorporates elements about like Robin Hood and stuff. And these novels were incredibly popular. So, and kind of had historical fiction for adults take off. As children's literature becomes more popular, so did historical fiction written for them. And it's connected to didacticism and education as well, right? Like learning about history. Often works of historical fiction will cluster around certain periods of history, which usually follow the social studies curriculum of K through 12. Frequent historical settings include the American Revolution, Civil War, frontier life, westward expansion, World War I, the Great Depression, and the Holocaust. So lots of times, if you probably were assigned a historical fiction book to read in school, might have been in a social studies class or connected to something that you were also studying in social studies at the time. Really notable works: Little House on the Prairie, that's westward expansion for sure. Johnny Tremain, that's set during the time of the American Revolution. Witch of Blackbird Pond, pre-American Revolution, about American colonies, colonial life, settling of Massachusetts. These years are all the years in which these books were published, not the years in which they are set. My Brother Sam is Dead, novel about the American Revolution. Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, the life of African Americans in the South during the Great Depression. Sarah, Plain and Tall, also westward expansion. Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which is about the Holocaust. Why read historical fiction? Why write historical fiction? Well, it does let us learn about history in a different way. It can let people or countries deal with particular kinds of trauma. The trauma of the struggle for civil rights, the trauma of the Holocaust, for example. It may also exhibit a nostalgia for a different time. A lot of books about westward expansion have a very kind of nostalgic tone about what it would be like to be a pioneer. And they also help articulate and experience a national identity, and are often linked to nationalism. What problems might we encounter with historical fiction? Well, it should be accurate, right? It needs to be true, even though it's fiction, right? The historical part of it needs to be accurate. It also needs to be authentic. It needs to be plausible. And this is a concept that's often a critique of certain books of historical fiction, which is that they are presentist, or that they exhibit presentism. And that's that this work depicts an ideology or a psychology more characteristic of the present than of the actual past. We see this so much in movies or other representations of the past where characters think and act much more like modern day people than they would have, 200 years ago. I mean, especially in terms of like female characters who are like, outspoken about gender equality or things like that. That is just, it's not that those ideas weren't present hundreds of years ago, but they weren't necessarily commonplace and they weren't often socially acceptable. But so, yeah, you want to make sure that the historical fiction you're reading gives you an accurate picture of the past. It's not just like characters who are basically 21st century characters playing dress up in old time clothes. Historical fiction has a lot of formal qualities that you should be aware of. Look for introductions, afterwords, author's notes, epilogues. They're far more common in works of historical fiction, and they should not be ignored. These are often the places where authors want to really go into historical fact or kind of show their sources. These are important places to note in the work. And for the two novels that you have for this week, yeah, notice how Curtis uses these other parts of the book to establish historical fact. For Tuesday, I want you to think about authenticity and presentism in terms of whichever book you have. Are there places where the characters act like you might think of as too modern? Or do they really seem like people who could have existed during the Great Depression in the case of Bud Not Buddy, or the 1960s for The Watsons Go to Birmingham? Okay, I will see you in class.